Its face is human.
It looks exactly like a human face.
It walks on two legs.
He says if we see them, they come to attack us.
And for thousands of years, it's been part of Tibetan folklore. But could the Yeti be more than just a story?
It made a noise like this.
There is some kind of biped creature out there.
People find new species in very unexpected places.
I'm Mark Evans, a scientist on a mission. If there's a rational explanation for the Yeti, I'm determined to find it. And with ancient remains...
Oh, that is gruesome.
...yielding startling new evidence.
There is always a scientific base to any legend.
I'm starting to wonder. Is 21st century science about to unlock the age-old secret of the Yeti?
This could be the real Yeti. Maybe he's existing.
A couple of years ago, I was involved in an extraordinary university-based project to see if 21st century science could finally solve the mystery of the Yeti. Well, the results proved to be incredibly thought-provoking, but also massively controversial. Based on the DNA analysis of the two most credible hair samples we could find in the high Himalayas, the lead scientist proposed that the biological explanation for the Yeti could be some kind of polar bear hybrid.
I think that where the Yeti is seen, it's actually one of these hybrid bears because they're not behaving like a normal bear. Polar bears hunt humans, so perhaps these hybrid bears in the Himalayas do that too, and that would add to its reputation and the fear that everybody has of the Yeti.
Professor Sykes' bold idea certainly challenged the standard view. But for some, he was stretching the evidence too far. As you can imagine, it was the equivalent of throwing a hand grenade into the world of both bear evolution and Bigfoot research. And a debate has raged ever since. Put simply, we still don't know if a polar bear hybrid exists or has ever existed in the Himalaya, let alone whether it explains the Yeti. So I'm picking up my investigation in Italy, where I've come to question an important eyewitness. Reinhold Messner is one of the world's greatest mountaineers. Renowned for making the first ascent of Mount Everest without carrying oxygen, he was also the first to summit all 14 of the world's 8,000-metre peaks. Even after losing 7 toes to frostbite, he was unstoppable. But it's not his superhuman achievements I've come to talk about. Now in his 70s, Messner is one of the few Westerners who actually claims to have seen a Yeti.
I was trying to cross the eastern part of Tibet. After 2 weeks, more or less, I arrived at a river. These rivers are very difficult because my toes are not there. The balance is not perfect. When I was out on the other side, it was getting dark. And in this moment, this creature was in front of me. It was clearly on 2 legs. Very near. And it was going very quickly. Like a human being.
Did it make any noise? Could you smell it?
It made a noise like this. Quite a strong smell. A few seconds later it was gone, disappearing in the back of the woods.
Forgive me, but I've got to ask this. Did you think at any point, you were exhausted, you were wet, it was high altitude, that it was all playing tricks on your mind?
No. I was totally in good shape mentally. I went to the spot where he was standing. I could see the footprints. And so I was beginning to say to myself that this could be the real Yeti. Maybe he's existing.
Messner was hooked. With typical single-mindedness, he found out everything he possibly could about the legend.
After my sighting, I begin seriously to ask everywhere about the Yeti.
So was it? Despite the strange human-like footprints, he soon reached a more plausible conclusion.
There is no doubt for me that the Yeti legend is based on a bear. And it became 100% clear there is no other answer.
Large bears are found in the Himalaya, and they're about as rare as Yeti sightings. But could the beast that stalked Messner have been something even more unusual? A hybrid bear, perhaps, with polar bear DNA. During a later expedition, Messner claims to have seen an odd-looking bear.
I could see at least one with a white head, at least part of a white head. I think it's a population with certain things, certain hair, certain size, and maybe some different behaviors. And they eat a lot of meat.
So let me be clear about this then. You're saying the Yeti is a special form of brown bear?
The Yeti story is based on a special bear, on a huge bear, living in the Himalaya. This special bear is the bear and the Yeti in one.
On the face of it, it does sound like Messner's special bear could be a little bit polar bear. It's big, it's partly white, and in Tibet at least, it appears to be notably carnivorous. But the hard genetic evidence for a polar bear hybrid is extremely limited. And aside from bears, recent discoveries in human evolution have thrown up another equally enticing Yeti candidate. And it's a possibility that I've also been busy exploring. Now, the idea that the Yeti is based on some kind of prehistoric human is regarded by most people as pretty implausible. But I'm about to meet a man who is convinced he has seen recent evidence of just such a creature.
We said, that's bipedal. That's got to be a biped of some sort.
It's a fascinating zoological mystery. But what, if anything, is the Yeti? Legendary mountaineer Reinhold Messner believes it's some kind of special bear. A theory that fits with recent but controversial DNA tests pointing to a possible polar bear brown bear hybrid. But I'm about to meet another climber who's convinced that he has new evidence for a very different kind of creature.
This is October last year, up near the highest unclimbed mountain in the world. And this is now...
Just 9 months ago, respected British mountaineer Steve Berry saw something that completely stunned him.
We'd literally just got up to the col. We'd only been there a couple of minutes, and Karma said, "Hey, Steve, look, there's some really unusual tracks."
It's an extraordinary print, isn't it?
It's an incredible set of tracks. 1 foot exactly in front of the other, all the way across. Not a bit of, feet slightly apart or anything like you would expect of some four-legged creature.
When you looked at these tracks, what went through your head?
We said, that's got to be a biped of some sort.
How can you be so sure there is no possibility of there being people here?
This is days and days away from human habitation. It's completely in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it really is uninhabited, unexplored, unmapped.
It's crazy extreme territory, isn't it?
You would have to have serious mountaineering gear to get up onto that slope.
So why not snow leopard?
Snow leopard prints are offset. It just wouldn't put 1 foot in front of the other like that.
No possibility in your mind that it could be a bear?
I've seen bear prints on snow on a number of occasions. It's a big creature. It walks with its feet apart. It has a double track.
On your way back down, did you show anybody the pictures?
It was 3 days down to the nearest hamlet, 4 houses, and this lady and her husband were standing in their porch. So we got talking, and eventually he talked to me about the Yeti.
So what did he think of your photos?
He looked at them and said immediately, "Oh yes, Migu."
Without hesitation?
Without hesitation.
Migu is the local name for a wild man, or Yeti, and Steve was careful to note down what the villager told him about this creature.
He said the migu lived up in the snows. He had seen it once, 11 years ago. It stood still, upright, arms by its side. It was human height. He said it was well known that the Yeti could imitate the sounds of a dog, cat, horse or yak. They're well used to seeing bear tracks, they know the difference. He said you can always tell a migu track because they place one foot in front of the other.
What do you think made those tracks?
I'm utterly convinced now that there is some kind of biped creature out there that we just don't see very often. And it has a vast, vast area where it can keep away from humans.
Human, bear, or make-believe? To get any further with my Yeti investigation, I need to follow this legend back to its source, into the thin air of the high Himalaya. I'm Mark Evans, a scientist on a mission. According to a controversial new theory, the Yeti of popular myth could be not a primate, but some kind of unknown bear. And in search of proof, I'm in the central Himalaya, heading to a remote valley in northern Nepal.
Not much is known about the high-altitude bears of the Himalaya. They're very thin on the ground and rarely seen. So I'm heading for a very remote part of northern Nepal, close to the Tibetan border, which is a renowned hotspot. It's been a conflict zone where bears have been blamed for raiding precious crops and for killing livestock, including horses and cows. It's clear that some of the killers, at least, are powerful predators, and I'm intrigued to know whether that's because they're a little bit polar bear.
Unlike grizzlies, polar bears are known to deliberately hunt humans. But no one is suggesting that these Arctic predators live here. What's being proposed is a hybrid bear, part polar bear, part brown bear. And to test this theory, I need to get my hands on body parts. DNA preserved in fur, bones or even flesh just might take me a step closer to solving the mystery of the Yeti. Right at the start of this investigation, I was eager to team up with Dr. Charlotte Lindquist, a world expert in bear genetics. All brown bears belong to the same species. But while they've been thoroughly studied in Europe and America, it seems we don't know much about them in the Himalaya.
We know so little about the brown bears in this area, in the Tibetan Plateau and in the Himalayan mountains. Very, very little has been done. Very few samples have been analyzed. They are just very rare. In the western mountains, they're known as the Himalayan brown bear. The brown bears that are found on the Tibetan Plateau are called the Tibetan brown bear, but they are all the same species.
So what if we throw a polar bear hybrid into the mix? How would that fit in?
It is possible that there are hybrids that they possibly migrated into the Himalayan mountains, and these are descendants of hybrid bears. That is entirely possible, but I definitely would want to see more data.
Okay, so what needs to be done to settle it?
For sure, we will need more samples. Hair is very good, bone, teeth. The more DNA we look at, the better.
If I get you samples, will you categorically be able to tell me what they are?
If I can get DNA from them, yes. I will be able to tell you what they are.
Hybrid bears do exist. About 10 years ago, a trophy hunter shot a rather weird-looking bear in the Canadian Arctic. DNA tests confirmed that its dad was a grizzly bear and its mum a polar bear. Several years later, when another so-called growler bear was shot, it turned out to be a second-generation hybrid, which goes to prove these crossbred animals can reproduce successfully. But how could growler bears end up in the high Himalaya, so far from the Arctic? What are these hybrids actually like? Well, we know from radio tracking brown bears that dispersing males can travel hundreds of miles. So it's possible, at least in theory, that polar bear DNA could penetrate quite rapidly into Central Asia.
As for the effect of this exotic DNA, there's a revealing study from Osnabrück Zoo in Germany. After 24 years of sharing the same enclosure, a male polar bear and a female brown bear finally got it together. And their hybrid cubs, called Tips and Taps, were a kind of mash-up between the two species. So long neck, furry soles, unmistakably polar bear, broad face,
rounded shoulder humps, clearly brown bear. In terms of behaviour, though, Tips and Taps turned out to be much more like their dad. They'd pounce violently on things with their paws and then shake them really harshly with their jaws, both behaviours that polar bears do when they're hunting seals on the ice. So could some of this polar bear aggression have found its way into the bears of the Himalaya? And if so, could it have anything to do with Yetis? It's late summer, and in Nepal's Sum Valley, I'm looking for physical evidence of a possible polar bear hybrid. Villagers here have been clashing with bears, and with help from my guide, Tashi Bista, I'm hoping to find out more about these marauding predators and get my hands on some all-important samples for Charlotte. Do many trekkers come up here?
Well, not a lot. I mean, like, it's quite a remote area. Actually, you're the first foreigner after the earthquake.
My first eyewitness is a man called Chitra, a farmer and village elder. Chitra, what problems have the bears caused you? Has anybody been killed by the bears?
तिर बग्रा बेराहरूलाई पनि उनीहरूले चाहिँ समय समयमा नष्ट गर्छ मारिदिन्छ बाह्रतिर गर्छ दुईटा जाति चाहिँ मान्छेले चाहिँ एउटा त मार्यो एउटा चाहिँ यहाँबाट चाहिँ उसको हालले चाहिँ यस्तो उसको नाङ लामो हुने रहेछ है मान्छेले यस्तो गर्ने साथ त सबैको तारेर छाला काटेर मासुसम्म काटेर उसमा
It soon emerges that Chitra has seen two very different kinds of bear.
ताला बसिनले चाहिँ त्यो तालाको चाहिँ कालो हुने रहेछ यसो गरेर यसो यसो टुन्ड्रा गाम्रे.
These details point clearly to an Asian black bear, a species that only lives in forested areas.
माथि अलिक लेकको चाहिँ अलिक चाहिँ मैलो भने कि खैरो भन्ने त्यस्तो देख्ने रहेछ हुने रहेछ फुल्ला चाहिँ तालाको भन्दा एकदम चाहिँ बढी मुक्का हुन्छ अब मान्छेहरू देख्यो भने बढी सिधै मान्छेलाई चाहिँ टोक्नुपर्छ उसको नामै करिब करिब 2-3 इन्च 4 इन्च होला.
Could this more aggressive creature, I wonder, be the hybrid bear? Though he doesn't have any fur or bones from this animal, Chitra's description of it echoes what Messner told me back in Italy.
A bear can easily kill a yak. He can kill it with one hand on the neck. Like, it needs only one strike and a human being would be gone.
To reach brown bear country, I need to climb a lot higher. But at the next village, I'm in for a big surprise.
He says it walks on 2 feet.
I'm Mark Evans, and my Yeti investigation has brought me to a remote valley in Nepal, where large bears have killed livestock and even people. I'm hoping to find organic remains from these predators to test the controversial theory that the Yeti is some kind of polar bear hybrid. But my investigation is about to spread beyond just bears.
Okay, let's see on the map.
Okay, oh, so way further up.
So he says once around January, February, he saw the footprints on the way up.
And was it easy for him to tell it was a bear footprint?
He says you can tell the brown bear because it has like this little, very big, slightly longer, and then another finger here, which is quite small. Tibet mountain. But he says there's a species in Tibet that the footprints look exactly like human, and they're not like this. They have like legs like this, but that's in Tibet.
And what makes those footprints?
And he says it walks on 2 feet.
Really?
He says if we see them, they come to attack us. It's called a mite.
A mite?
Yeah. He said it's found mostly in Tibet, not here. He says once he saw a dead one, some people in Tibet had shot it.
What did it look like?
He says it looks like exactly like a human face. And he says that it was a shepherd who had gone to find his goat up in the mountains, and then he saw it, and it started chasing him. So he ran back and got his gun and shot it many times.
So that's really interesting.
Strange and interesting.
Wow. Thank you very much. To most of us, hairy wild men in the woods are about as believable as elves. They belong firmly in the realms of folklore. But then, just over 10 years ago, scientists in Indonesia made the incredible discovery of a real-life hobbit. East of Java, on the island of Flores, a Dutch scientist had heard folk tales about tiny, primitive-looking humans who were said to steal crops from villagers and sometimes babies before scampering back to their caves in the jungle. In the local Nage language, these voracious little people are known as Ibu Gogo, which roughly translates as Granny Glutton. In stories, these Ibu Gogo are very skillful at imitating the complex sounds of human speech, but not surprisingly, no one really paid any attention to any of this until 2003, that is, when in West Flores, excavations in a jungle cave unearthed the fossilised bones of, you guessed it, a tiny, primitive type of human. Suddenly, the Ibu Gogo didn't sound quite so make-believe. It appeared they might even be a folk memory from a time when we shared our world with a race of chattering, spear-wielding, hobbit-like humans. More than a decade on, and Homo floresiensis remains a mystery. We don't yet know who her ancestors were or how they managed to get to Flores. But crucially, most experts agree not just that Floresiensis really is a different kind of human, but that they overlapped with us. The latest radiometric dates tell us that they were around until about 50,000 years ago, the same time that we modern humans were spreading across Asia. The remarkable story of Indonesia's recently extinct little hobbits has been a real eye-opener. It even prompted the acclaimed science journal Nature to suggest that stories of other supposedly mythical humanoids, including Yetis, could be based on more than just tales. My search for fresh bear samples is proving tougher than I expected. If there's any comfort, it's that I've already managed to acquire several older samples from previous trips. When I went to meet Dr. Lindquist, I handed over these existing samples for genetic testing. Okay, now these are things collected over the last couple of years. First is this one, which is from a monastery. And it's claimed to be about 40 years old.
So where did you say this was from?
I didn't, and I'm not going to. Not now, because there's so much controversy surrounding this. I just want you to be able to focus on them as biological specimens.
Okay.
I will tell you eventually. So the next one is this one. Now this was collected allegedly by a Jesuit priest and about 60 years old.
So if we're able to get DNA from these samples here, then we're able to use very specific markers where we can identify what kind of animal it is, and if it's a bear, what kind of bear it is, and if there's any recent signature of hybridization.
With polar bears.
With polar bear. It'll be very, very interesting. I'm looking forward to this.
My third sample was given to me by Messner, and it comes with a bizarre backstory. On the eve of World War II, 5 officers from the Nazi SS sneak into Tibet, where they hope to persuade the Hermit Kingdom to attack the British Empire. But for SS leader Heinrich Himmler, there is another, more personal objective.
Especially the people around Himmler, they were hoping to find an animal which was looking like a human being. They were hoping to find the proof of a special human being, of a stronger, better, bigger human. They wanted to show that the Aryan race is something special, and they were hoping that the Yeti, the snowman, is one part of the Aryan race.
Group leader Ernst Schaefer was a keen hunter, but in the absence of Yetis, all he collected were a few high-altitude bears. Trophies that now belong to Messner.
Do you think Schaefer could have been having a bit of fun, a practical joke? From the letters you wrote to him, do you think he was a funny man?
No, he was not British, he was German.
So this is just not very good taxidermy.
With luck, DNA expert Dr. Charlotte Lindquist will dig genetic gold out of this Nazi Yeti. Back in Nepal, I'm hoping to find more recent samples, but I'm running out of valley. My last hope may lie with the monks, the guardians of powerful relics, including what they say are the remains of Yetis. After a lot more climbing, my guide Tashi and I can almost see the top of the valley and the border with Tibet. Everyone here is busy with the harvest, but my search for new Yeti samples has so far failed to reap reward.
Namaste.
It's clear that we're deep in bear country.
He says that he has seen some bears that are black and they have the white mark here. He says there's somebody there who encountered a bear.
But all the stories are about the smaller black bear.
She says she just saw a black bear like this tall, just across the river on the forest. He was climbing a tree.
It's in the tree. Yeah, that fits.
Oh, she said it's not a Yeti because it walks on four legs.
Okay. When it comes to body parts, no one has anything to offer. And when I ask about the Mite or wild man, the villagers just point up to the top of the mountain. The last stop before the Tibetan border is a small monastery. It's a 6-hour climb, but according to Messner, Yeti relics are sometimes kept by the monks for special ceremonies.
If you find one of the relics a hand, they are normally in the cellars of the monastery.
The legend of the Yeti is ancient, possibly very ancient.
In my view, the legend is older than the beginning of Buddhism, maybe 15,000 years.
We're almost there. It's been quite a walk, huh?
Few outsiders venture this far. But even at this late hour, we're welcomed inside.
We're here, man. We're there.
Made it.
It's my bed. It is now.
So much for reaching the top of the mountain. Sunrise reveals still bigger peaks, rising above me on every side. My ears, meanwhile, are filled with the hypnotic murmur of chanting monks.
You can hear that I'm slightly out of breath because at this height still, even though I've been walking for days, still not properly adjusted, and the air is pretty thin.
What really takes your breath away, though, is the view.
I'm currently standing at around 12,000 feet, but towering way above me in the distance there, that snow-capped peak is the top of Mount Ganesh, and I have to say it does look a little bit like a Yeti itself. Now down there, that is black bear country, but if you carry on walking the trail down below the monastery down here, you start to get more and more scrubby hillsides, and that's classic brown bear country. And then you hit this incredibly inhospitable, harsh, barren environment up there. Now that wall of rock is essentially the border with Tibet. This is as far as foreigners like me are allowed to go.
After his morning mantras, head Lama Lobsang Tashi agrees to see me. During his 40-odd years here, he's heard a lot of tales, including stories of a dangerous being called a Mire.
Can you tell me about the Mire? What is it? So how big is it? How tall?
That's too short for a brown bear. Perhaps I'm taking what he says too literally.
Do you think the Mirai is a real animal or a spiritual animal? I'm trying to find body parts, hair or bone or flesh. Do you have a relic from this animal that I could have a look at?
Samples. The more DNA we look at, the better.
My failure to get new samples is becoming a problem. But it's striking that even the llama thinks the Yeti either is or was something real.
If I want to find out more about the Mirai, where do I need to go and who do I need to speak to?
It seems the higher you climb in the Himalaya, the more likely you are to hear about the Yeti. In fact, the legend is especially strong near Mount Everest, among a Tibetan group known as the Sherpas. It was from these people that we got the word Yeti, though in their minds, there were always two different types. And curiously, I've been finding exactly the same distinction here.
All these names for what we call Yeti. It's confusing, isn't it? But there's good news. I've got my head around it. Now, you've got to remember, in the area we're talking about, there are at least 2 languages and a whole host of dialects. But if you put the names aside and just focus on the descriptions, then everything becomes a whole lot clearer. People who live locally in the high Himalaya are talking about 2 very different animals. Both are dangerous and people are incredibly wary of them, and they are very real animals. People are absolutely adamant about that. Now, one is very large. When it stands on its back legs, it may be 7 foot tall, but it spends most of its time on 4 legs. It's hairy and it's brown, and it has a reputation for killing livestock, including yaks. Now, I'm pretty confident it's some kind of bear. The other animal is very different. It's smaller, about maybe 5 foot tall. It's also hairy, but it's reddish brown and it's always on 2 legs. But here's the intriguing bit. It looks very human. The notion of a surviving humanoid gained a certain credibility in the 1950s after a mountaineer called Eric Shipton photographed human-like footprints near Everest Base Camp. But no Yeti has ever been found, and 65 years on, puzzling footprints are still the closest thing to evidence that anyone can produce for a bipedal primate. The trouble with footprints is that one man's Yeti is another man's bear, which is why I am keen to throw a little science at the subject. Okay, front feet first, pigeon-toed is the key.
I want to show what kind of tracks a large bear might actually make in the snow.
Here goes, back feet. Now, I appreciate that this may look a little Mickey Mouse, but rest assured, I have done my homework.
I'm producing a possible bear track based on new data collected by doctoral student Catherine Shine.
We started right at the very beginning, just videoing them moving backwards and forwards, starting with a walk and then getting faster.
Isn't it interesting, if you just slow this up, move it, how this right back leg here, when it places flat on the ground, how human that looks?
Yes, bears have the same foot posture that we do, so their whole foot is on the ground from their heels to their toes, and they are the only large mammal that have that foot posture. Plus the fact that their feet are about the same size as ours. You end up with a very human-looking foot.
What I'd like to get my head around is what you'd see, let's say Snow, if you were tracking a bear, one of these guys, what you'd see in terms of their foot placements.
What's striking is how closely these animals bring their feet together, despite their huge size.
They are really close together, aren't they?
They do bring their feet right underneath them.
The cameras also reveal that brown bears do sometimes place their back feet into the prints left by their front feet.
This gait is fascinating, stepping in your own footprint. Is it possible that a bear could create a linear trackway?
Yes.
In other words, a bear on all fours doesn't always have to make double tracks.
Nice.
For instance, it might not do so when it's galloping. But on the steep slope where Steve Berry saw his Yeti prints, running would probably be suicidal.
A bear couldn't make those tracks.
On the other hand, my demonstration does seem to suggest that if a bear walks along by overstepping in its own footprints, and we know that brown bears sometimes do that, then it could produce a trackway that looks eerily like it's been made by a pigeon-toed biped with very weird, very flat feet.
Back in the Himalaya, my hunt for Yeti samples is taking me into spectacular new territory, into a desert wilderness where I'll be meeting someone who says he's seen not footprints, but a decapitated Yeti. Can cutting-edge science solve the mystery of the Yeti, a being from Tibetan folklore that's said to stand upright and harm villagers? In the high Himalaya, I've heard accounts of not one, but two Yeti-like creatures. One of them walks on two legs and looks human.
Since it looks like exactly like a human face.
The other, a large brown bear, is my prime suspect, and I'm investigating the theory that it's an unknown type of bear with polar bear DNA. In search of hard evidence, I'm leaving the Somme Valley and heading west into the once forbidden kingdom of Upper Mustang.
Compared to where I've just been, this is a different world.
According to Messner, it's a world where ancient beliefs still hold sway.
The legend came to the world out of these primitive communities. They are Tibetans, real Tibetans. The culture is Tibetan, the architecture is Tibetan. There is still alive the old legends, the old stories of the Yetis, of beings between humans and wild animals.
Shielded by high mountains from the monsoon, Upper Mustang is as barren as Arizona.
All the roads as good as this, Tashi. It's probably a long way down.
It's a rough 2-day drive, but just a few years ago, even this wouldn't have been possible. The grasslands along the Tibetan border are known to attract bears. Peakers make tempting targets, along with any unguarded livestock. For half the year, Sunam lives up here, keeping a close eye on his yaks and goats. Even for Sunam, though, a marauding bear is an extremely rare sight.
Do you or any of the nomads you know, do you have any body parts from bears that you've found? Flesh or bone or hair? Did you hear the bear when it came to the marmots? Was there any noise?
So
Sunam, would you be happy for me to have a small amount of the hair so I can test it for science?
At long last, I'm closing in on something tangible. People here use the remains of dangerous animals in religious ceremonies and keep what they find under lock and key.
Excellent.
This tuft of bear fur should yield plenty of DNA for Charlotte. It's taken weeks to get just one sample, but in this small, close-knit world, news of my interest in Yetis is spreading fast. Within days of visiting the nomad, Tashi and I are told to visit a man called Pemba, a traditional healer. who roams widely across Nepal and Tibet, gathering herbs from the high mountains to make his medicines. Around here, the wild man is known as the Yeti, and according to villagers, Pemba has recent first-hand knowledge of this elusive being.
So Pemba, do they walk like this? So they stand, are they like this?
That's how it rests, he says.
Rests like this.
They rest like this, and then
does it stand up?
Yeah. And that's as tall as it can stand, he says.
And then it walks like this. Okay, that's very helpful, very helpful.
While I'm wondering what to make of all this, Pemba tells us about a recent grisly encounter with a Yeti. In these parts, a trumpet made from a Yeti bone is believed to have special power.
Where exactly was this cave that had the dead Yeti in it? And that's in Tibet?
Yeah, that's on the Tibet Chinese side.
Pemba, would it be possible to have a look at this body part? Okay, here it is.
Like the nomad's clump of fur, Pemba's Yeti bone is clearly a treasured possession.
This is it.
The unfused growth plates on the bone tell me that its owner wasn't fully grown. But what does it come from?
The way this is shaped is quite human. So, kneecap here, this bit here runs in there, in that groove. But it's only this long, so it's very short.
Unfortunately, the upper part of the bone is missing. To get a definite ID, I'm going to need a sample. Adding to the bear fur donated by the nomad, I now have a precious piece of Yeti bone.
Okay, that's good.
If I can get DNA from them, I will be able to tell you what they are.
For any animal, Charlotte needs only a fragment to reveal its identity. Unless, of course, it's an animal that doesn't officially exist. A species that hasn't yet been sampled, named, and catalogued. Unlikely as this is, history tells us that even in the modern era, large mammals continue to be discovered. Rewind to 1901. As the 20th century kicks off, the world's first electric vacuum cleaner is revving up. Science, meanwhile, discovers the okapi. It's 6 foot tall, lives in Africa, and until now has been considered purely mythical. A year later, and as the first movie theatre opens in LA, up pops a real-life King Kong, the mountain gorilla. Fast forward to 1929. It's the year we get colour TV. And another great ape, the bonobo. 1937. Helicopters are taking off. Then from deep in the jungles of Cambodia, scientists send news of the coupre, a huge horned beast that weighs in at over a ton. And finally, 1992. The Human Genome Project is in full swing when yet another totally new species of wild ox comes to light, the ultra-secretive Saola. We might think we've seen it all, but Earth is a big planet. There are still places to hide. Back in Nepal, I'm about to call bear geneticist Dr. Charlotte Lindquist. By now, she should have results from my 3 previously collected samples. and I'm curious to know if she's found any evidence for an unknown bear, a hybrid bear that could explain the legend of the Yeti. Before I came to Nepal, I gave 3 previously collected samples to Dr. Charlotte Lindquist for genetic testing, and I'm itching to hear the results. If she's found evidence for a polar bear hybrid, it could take me a huge step closer to solving the mystery of the Yeti. Charlotte, hi.
Hi, Mark. How are you doing? It's great to see you.
This is going to have to be quick. Have you got anything from the samples that I gave you?
Of course, yes. Yes.
If we start with the first sample, the monastery head.
We did get DNA from it, and it turned out as, are you ready? Himalayan brown bear.
Okay, that's cool. It fits because that came from Ladakh in the Western Himalayas.
Really? Okay. Well, there you go.
So it fits. That's good.
Yes.
Is there any evidence on it of polar bear hybrid?
No polar bear. Just simply straight bear.
So what about the hair sample from the Jesuit?
The Jesuit priest. So the hair also came from a bear, but this time it's a Tibetan brown bear.
That was from the Eastern Himalaya.
Okay, and that's where we expect to find Tibetan bears.
And again, any polar bear in there?
To me, they look like straight bears. We saw no sign of polar bear in the DNA from those samples.
Okay, but that's testing. Good, okay, so that only leaves the Nazi Yeti then. So the hair first.
That was an interesting one. We did get DNA. It was not quite as well preserved, but I can tell you that the hair came from a Tibetan brown bear. The tooth, that's another story. The tooth did not come from a bear. What we got was dog.
No surprises there. Listen, I have finally found you another sample.
Okay.
Look at this. It looks like a toenail clipping, but it's actually a tiny piece of a femur bone that a herbal doctor says he found in a cave on the Tibetan plateau about 6 or 7 years ago. The bone was in a rotting carcass, but the carcass was missing his head, and he's absolutely adamant that the body was from a Meti or a Yeti, which is really intriguing.
Oi.
And also, I have got a bear hair sample. I got it from a really lovely nomad who's living high up, very close to the Tibetan plateau, clearly a big bear of some sort, and left some of its fur on some bushes that were around where it had been digging, and this is what he collected. So 2 samples on their way, and I'll see you when I get back.
Very good. Great talking to you. Okay, you too. Bye. Bye.
It's too soon to write off the hybrid bear theory. With 2 fresh samples, there could yet be a surprise. But what about the Mite or wild man? Is there anything, either living or extinct, that could possibly explain such a creature? It's becoming more and more apparent that we haven't always been alone. Even till quite recently, there have been other kinds of human on Earth. Everyone's heard of our extinct relatives, the Neanderthals. Right until the last ice age, these stocky, incredibly tough people roamed across Europe and Western Asia, and we now know they weren't the simple oafish cavemen that we once imagined. Then there are the so-called hobbits from Flores, discovered barely 10 years ago. Though much smaller than us, they were clearly clever little devils. But just 5 years ago came the surprise announcement from scientists that they'd discovered yet another species of recent human, which they called Denisovans. Now, we can only guess what they look like because all we have is a tiny finger bone and a couple of teeth. But just this has been enough for us to get hold of their DNA. And I tell you what, it tells an intriguing story. Incredibly, it looks like these mysterious Denisovans could be a part of my Yeti puzzle. The plot thickened recently when scientists studying how Tibetans can thrive at high altitude stumbled on a remarkable and thought-provoking genetic link. When I visit somewhere really high, like the Himalaya, my body is starved of oxygen. I'm reasonably fit, but even the slightest physical exertion leaves me gasping for air. And it's the same for virtually everyone, even for seasoned mountaineers like Messner. But fairly quickly, our bodies respond by bumping up the production of oxygen-carrying red blood cells that help us extract the scarce oxygen from every breath, delivering it to all our body tissues, but especially our brains. It works pretty well, short term. There is, however, a downside. All these extra red blood cells thicken the blood, turning it, if you like, from water into honey. And long term, gluppier blood can lead to a whole host of life-threatening medical complications. The remarkable thing about the Tibetans, who've survived up here for thousands of years, is that their bodies respond very differently to low oxygen levels. And a key part of their success at high altitude is down to a tiny bit of DNA that they got from guess who? Denisovans. Think of it as a kind of genetic app for how to survive on top of the world. Before I even set off for the Himalaya, I had to know more about this high-altitude mutation and whether it really could have come from another human species. Known as EPAS1, the gene in question has been closely analysed by human geneticist Professor Rasmus Nielsen.
Rasmus, how confident are you that the Tibetans got this variant of EPAS1 from Denisovans?
Well, we know there must have been interbreeding between humans and Denisovans. There's no other way you can explain that extreme similarity between the Tibetan DNA sequence and the DNA sequence you find in the Denisovans.
So that's two different species breeding together but producing fertile offspring. That kind of goes against what I learnt in biology at school.
Well, in biology, it's not always so black and white. Sometimes you have different species that can breed together. Perhaps this interbreeding with other species might have been more important in human evolution than people previously thought. Modern humans came out of Africa. They had to adapt to all these different environments. It takes time normally to adapt, but humans have been able to spread out and adapt in a very short amount of time. And one of the ways that we've been able to do that is by hijacking genes from other species. It's like fast-tracking evolution.
Modern Tibetans presumably have a whole host of genes that allow them to thrive at high altitude, but you've honed in on one very specific gene. Why is it so important?
There's no doubt that the genetic variant that the Tibetans have in EPAS1 give them a big survival advantage in high altitude. One benefit is that they're more likely to carry their pregnancies to term. Women that don't have this particular genetic variant, they will tend to suffer from hypertension. The native Tibetans don't suffer from that in the same degree because they have this variant that's not shared with people in the rest of the world.
What if the Yeti, like the Ibugogo of Flores, is based on a real but mysterious type of human, drawn not from fantasy, but from human memory and real encounters? We modern humans, Homo sapiens, don't have a great track record when it comes to sharing planet Earth with other human species, of which there have been several. Using our advanced problem-solving skills, eventually we won out over other human competition. But there's one environment where Homo sapiens struggled to survive, and it's here, at high altitude, where oxygen is in short supply. And that makes me wonder whether Denisovans, with their special high-altitude adaptations, could have survived and thrived up here on the Tibetan plateau, out of our reach. Now, we know that their European cousins, Neanderthals, had succumbed to Homo sapiens by around 40,000 years ago. But here's the big question. Is it possible that up here, on the Tibetan plateau, the Denisovans could have hung on longer? And if so, until how recently? There may be a way to find out.
So 25128, last one.
2 years ago, when I first started investigating the Yeti, I collected saliva samples from a dozen Sherpas, people of Tibetan origin, who now live in Nepal. Back then, I was looking for Neanderthal DNA. But maybe the key to this mystery lies in the DNA that we got from Denisovans. In theory, scientists can use this Denisovan DNA to estimate how recently we were interbreeding with these other humans.
Job done.
This contact date is something that Rasmus Nielsen also wants to pin down. So he's agreed to add my Sherpa data to his ongoing study and share the results. It's work that no one else has done. Meanwhile, my hunt for Yeti samples in Upper Mustang is reaching a climax. So far, I've managed to get fur and bone. Now it seems I'm about to get some flesh.
Oh, that is gruesome.
In Upper Mustang on Nepal's arid Tibetan frontier, I'm on the trail of two possible Yetis. One is a hybrid bear. The other is a type of human that may have survived here until surprisingly recently. The village of Sarang was once an important staging post on an ancient trade route between India and Tibet. Tashi and I have been told about a Yeti hand hidden inside its crumbling palace. With the owner's permission, we've come to take a small sample for genetic testing. The mysterious relic is kept in an upper room, along with other fetishes that protect against evil.
Oh my God. Tashi, where is the Yeti hand?
Yes.
Oh, here.
Yeah.
Oh, that is gruesome. There's three hands or paws. This is definitely human, isn't it?
Yeah, that is definitely.
This is definitely human. Do you know what the story is behind that?
I was told that it's the hand of a thief who tried to break in, and so his hand was cut as a punishment.
It's not the severed hand of the thief, but the two paws that have been identified to us as Yeti.
Okay, these look like bear.
They do?
Yeah, they look like bear, but what bear though? And they are very, very old. Charlotte will be excited that we found these.
I now have 3 new samples with which to test the polar bear hybrid theory. But what about the Denisovans, an extinct human species with whom we once interbred? Is it conceivable that the Tibetan plateau could have been a last hideout for them, beyond our reach? It's hard to picture anyone living up here without crops and domestic animals. Yet until recently, these high-altitude steppes were home to vast herds of antelope and wild yak. For anyone who could stand the thin air, it probably offered good hunting, even during the worst of the last ice age, 20,000 years ago. Supposing this was their last refuge, though, then how long could stories about Denisovans actually survive, passed down by word of mouth? A really surprising answer comes from Australia's Aboriginal peoples. Several of their stories mention known events, like changing sea levels, that have been dated to at least 13,000 years ago. Which goes to show that stories passed down orally from generation to generation can last for far longer than you might think. Six weeks after returning from Nepal, and the final chapter of my own Yeti story is about to unfold. Charlotte and Rasmus have each crunched the hard-won data I gave them, and I've come to find out what they've discovered.
I was surprised, yes.
Forget colourful folk tales. Can modern science finally explain the legend of the Yeti?
What we really need is more genetic data.
According to one controversial theory, the Yeti could be a hybrid bear, part grizzly, part polar bear.
It is possible that there are hybrids. If I can get DNA from them, I will be able to tell you what they are.
But I've also been considering an intriguing human candidate.
We know there must have been interbreeding between humans and Denisovans.
Bear, wild man, or make-believe? It's time for the DNA to speak. I'm calling first on bear expert, Dr. Charlotte Lindquist. Results from 3 previous samples have already started to colour in the map. Sample 1 from northwest India, checked out as Himalayan brown bear. To the east, sample 2 ID'd as Tibetan brown bear. And it was the same story for Messner's bizarre Nazi Yeti. So what about my 3 latest samples from Nepal?
What interests me is they kind of sit kind of like halfway between the other 2 samples. So it's sort of which way will they go, or will it be something completely new?
Okay.
All right?
All right.
You know, and I don't.
I do.
I'm handing over the dots now to you. So if you start with this one, so the middle one here, that's the nomad hair sample.
Nice DNA, it worked very well, and it definitely came from a Tibetan brown bear. So blue.
1 down, 2 to go.
This one is from the alleged Yeti paw, the Yeti hand that was in this ancient palace. It was very old. Did you get DNA? That's the first thing.
Yes, I was surprised, and I can tell you that it definitely came from a bear, a different kind of bear.
Really?
Yeah.
And
a whole 3rd kind of bear.
Well, what?
This one here was from a black bear.
You know, there are no trees in Sarang, no forest at all. So I kind of
the genetics does not lie. That was from a black bear.
So that's a bit of an oddity for us. It's in the wrong place, but it's probably brought there by a trader.
So we need to give it a different color.
Okay.
Just 1 more left.
Now, this sample is for me the most intriguing because it was the femur bone, the thigh bone, allegedly from a Yeti. I was not sure at all what that is, but human was in my head.
Well, I can tell you with certainty that that was not a human. It was
not human.
It was definitely also from a bear. And in this case, I can say with certainty that that was a Tibetan brown bear.
Strike 3.
Another blue dot.
Black bear aside, we have 4 Tibetan brown bears, 1 Himalayan bear, and no polar bear in any of them.
We didn't find any evidence of any polar bear in these samples here that you sent to me.
So where does all this now leave us in terms of the polar bear, brown bear hybrid hypothesis? Does that hypothesis stack up?
I think based on what we know from the samples that you sent me, that we can put that theory to rest.
So if the legend of the Yeti has anything to do with bears, then the bears are just regular bears. But could the true source of the legend lie closer to home? When I first started out on this investigation, I did not anticipate that another human species would become a prime suspect in terms of explaining the Yeti legend. It's such an intriguing idea, but of course it may not be true. To explore it further, Professor Rasmus Nielsen from Berkeley University has been digging about in the DNA from the saliva samples that I collected from the Sherpas in the high Himalaya, and I'm about to get the results. Rasmus is either going to add a whole lot of weight to it, or he might blow it out of the water. We know that the ancestors of Tibetans, including Sherpas, bred with Denisovans. That's how Tibetans acquired the high-altitude variant of EPAS-1. The key question for me is how recently could this breeding have happened? To explain stories of wild men that are still told today, Denisovans would have to have survived till at least 13,000 years ago.
So, did you find EPAS-1 in my Sherpas?
Actually, we did. So it turns out that all of them contain the EPAS-1 variant that you also have in Tibet.
So every Sherpa had the EPAS-1 variant?
That's right, yeah.
That's a very good start. I like that. But obviously, the big thing for me is then trying to work out the most recent date that interbreeding could have taken place between Denisovans and the ancestors of those Sherpas and other Tibetans. So let's have a look at the results.
All right.
So what's the key element of this?
Yeah. So the thing to focus on here is the blue curve here.
It's all a matter of probability. Put simply, the curve tells me that interbreeding with Denisovans was most likely to have happened around 1,500 generations ago.
That's the most likely date, about 40,000 years.
But obviously I want to come this way and go, well, how recently could it have happened, which you could not rule out as a possibility from this data?
The most recent date that we cannot exclude is about 7,000 years.
What does that equate to in terms of generations?
So that's about 250 generations ago.
Okay, so what about 15,000 years?
Yeah, so 15,000 years, that would be about here on the curve. 15,000 years ago is really also quite plausible.
Okay, wow.
15,000 years is little more than 500 generations. And if other groups have remembered vivid events for similar spans of time, then why not Tibetans, with their tales of dangerous wild men?
It's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it? Somewhere on the Tibetan plateau, perhaps 15,000 years ago, small pioneering groups of Homo sapiens, modern humans, start to encounter powerfully built, dark-skinned people. People who seem better adapted than they are to the thin air, and who are skillful at hunting the plentiful game. Perhaps the encounters aren't always friendly. Perhaps when scientists talk about the interbreeding that we know took place, we should imagine instead something more akin to abduction, a recurring theme in Yeti tales from across the Himalaya. Suppose now that this rivalry continues for centuries, millennia even, until the last of the Denisovans are finally extinguished. And all that remains of these enigmatic hunters are some useful genetic mutations, now part of the Tibetans' DNA, and colourful stories of dangerous, hairy, bipedal beings who roam the high peaks. We tend to think of ourselves as the only humans, but there have been many others. And to my mind, at least, it now seems a very strong possibility that one of them, the Denisovans, could have been immortalised as Yetis.